When we think about agriculture, we often picture these neat rows of crops, right? Food, basically, heading straight for our table.
That's the common image, yeah.
But if you kind of pull back the lens, you see this much more intricate web. There's food, sure, but also a feed for livestock, fibers for clothes, and, well, increasingly, fuel for our cars.
And it's that last part, the fuel aspect, specifically using maize for ethanol in India, that's causing some significant ripples.
Interesting ripples is a good way to put it. It affects the whole system.
It really does. It shows how interconnected these sectors are. Government policies aiming for renewable energy, like this ethanol blending push, they can trigger these big shifts, huge consequences across agriculture.
Right.
So this deep dive, we're focusing specifically on the growing maize ethanol industry in India and the debates around it. There was a really good piece in the Indian Express recently that laid a lot of this out.
Ah, okay. So that's our primary source material here.
Exactly. And it's frankly vital stuff for anyone following the Indian economy, its agriculture, and definitely relevant for UPSC aspirants. It touches on so many key areas.
Okay, got it. So our mission for this deep dive, let's really try to unpack this maize ethanol thing, understand why it's happening, what the impacts are, and maybe, what the paths forward could look like.
Sounds good.
Let's start with a baseline. Before this big ethanol push, say, back around 2021, 22, what did the maize situation in India look like? Supply, demand, the usual picture.
Right. So before maize became a major focus for ethanol, the market was actually pretty balanced. Production was somewhere around 32 to 33 million tons annually.
Okay.
Domestic consumption took up about 28 million tons of that.
Which left a decent buffer.
Yeah, it left a comfortable margin for exports, which were running at about 3.7 million tons then.
Pretty stable. And who was using that domestic 28 million tons? Where was it mainly going?
The biggest player by far was the livestock feed sector. Poultry feed specifically used around 15 million tons.
Half of the domestic demand almost.
Pretty much. Then you had cattle feed using about 5 million tons. Industrial starch production was another big user, also around 5 million tons.
Starch, like for food processing, textiles.
Exactly, various industrial applications. Then direct human consumption was about 2 million tons, and the rest, maybe 1 million tons, went to seeds and other minor uses.
Okay, so a clear picture. Feed dominates, then industry, then human consumption, a stable system.
Relatively speaking, yes.
Now enter ethanol. Maize is suddenly a hot commodity for fuel. Why maize? What makes it so good for making ethanol?
It really comes down to the starch content. Maize has a lot of it, typically somewhere between 68 and 72%.
That's high.
Very high. And that high starch level makes it really efficient as a raw material for ethanol.
The conversion rate is pretty good. To roughly 1 ton of maize gives you about 380 liters of ethanol.
How does that work? Basically, the starch gets converted. Yeah, essentially. The process breaks down those complex starches into simple sugars. Then yeast gets added, which ferments those sugars into alcohol. And finally, that alcohol is distilled to get concentrated ethanol. The high starting starch content just means you get more ethanol out per ton of maize.
Makes sense. And this shift, this diversion of maize to ethanol, it wasn't a slow trickle, was it? The numbers you mentioned from the Indian Express article suggest a very rapid ramp-up.
Oh, incredibly rapid. Let's look at the figures. In the 2022-23 financial year, about 0.8 million tons of maize went into ethanol, producing around 31.5 crore liters.
Okay, less than 1 million tons.
Right. Now, fast forward just 1 year to 2023-24. That number jumps dramatically to 7.5 million tons of maize.
Wow. Nearly a 10-fold increase in maize usage.
Exactly, yielding about 286.5 crore liters of ethanol. And it doesn't stop there. The projections for the current year, 2024-25, based on contracts already in place, they're looking at potentially 12.7 million tons of maize.
12.7 million tons.
Yes, expected to produce a massive 484.3 crore liters of ethanol.
Goodness. Those numbers really paint a picture of massive disruption. You're essentially pulling a huge chunk of the maize supply out of its traditional uses.
That's precisely it. This huge new demand from the biofuel sector has fundamentally disrupted the established supply chain and created a real imbalance.
And like you said, ripples, or maybe dominoes is a better analogy here.
Yeah.
This huge demand shift is knocking over other parts of the agricultural sector. The first big one to feel it seems to be the livestock feed industry.
Absolutely. The first and hardest hit, you could argue. The poultry and cattle feed guys, they've always relied heavily on maize. It's a core ingredient. Now they're facing a double whammy. less maize available and much higher prices for what is available.
And maize isn't just a minor ingredient for them, is it? It's a huge part of their feed formulation.
Oh, absolutely critical. For broiler chickens, the ones raised for meat, maize can make up 55 to 65% of their feed.
More than half.
Yeah. For egg-laying hens, it's similar, maybe 50 to 60%. Even for cattle feed, it's a significant chunk, around 15 to 20%.
So if maize prices shoot up,
It directly slams their production costs. Meat, eggs, milk, the economics get squeezed immediately.
and those price hikes have been steep. The article mentioned prices going from, 14,000, 15,000 rupees per ton a few years ago?
Yeah, around that level.
To now hitting 24,000, 25,000 rupees per ton. That's nearly double in just 4 years.
It is a huge jump, and while other factors might play a small role, the overwhelming driver, the consensus is, it's this massive diversion of maize to ethanol plants. It's sucking supply away from the feed mills.
Okay, but the story doesn't end there. This maize ethanol link also seems to be having a weird sort of knock-on effect on the soybean market. How does that work?
Ah, yes. This is where it gets really interesting, and maybe a bit counterintuitive at first. It's about a byproduct.
A byproduct of making ethanol from maize.
Exactly. When you ferment and distill the maize to get ethanol, you're left with something called distiller's dried grains with solubles, DDGS for short.
DDGS.
Now, the key thing about DDGS is that while the starch is gone, the protein, fat, and fiber from the original maize kernel are concentrated. So maize DDGS is actually quite rich in protein, typically around 28 to 30%.
Protein, which is also vital for livestock feed, right?
Precisely. Feed manufacturers need protein sources. Traditionally, they've relied heavily on things like soybean meal, or more accurately, soybean de-oiled cake DOC, which is what's left after you extract the oil from soybeans. Mustard cake, cottonseed cake, groundnut cake are others.
So soybean DOC is a major protein source.
A very major one. But here's the catch. Soybean DOC has become relatively expensive. We're talking maybe 31,000 to 32,000 rupees per ton recently.
Quite pricey.
Now compare that to the maize DDGS emerging from these ethanol plants. Its price, more like 16,000 to 17,000 rupees per ton.
Wait, half the price for a decent protein source.
Pretty much. And there's also rice DDGS from ethanol made from broken rice, which can have even higher protein, maybe up to 45%, and that's selling for around 18,000, 19,000 rupees per ton. Still much cheaper than soy DOC.
That is a massive cost difference.
Sure.
It's obvious what feed manufacturers are going to do then.
Exactly. As more and more DDGS, both maize and rice-based, becomes available because of the ethanol push, feed companies are naturally starting to use it. It's a much cheaper protein ingredient. They're blending it into their feed formulations, sometimes substituting it partly for the more expensive soybean DOC.
Which means they need less soybean DOC overall.
Correct. And if the feed mills are buying less soybean DOC, then the companies that crush soybeans to get oil and DOC, well, they need less raw soybean grain from the farmers.
I see the chain reaction now. Lower demand for the end product, the DOC, leads to lower demand for the raw material, the soybean itself.
Precisely. And that puts downward pressure on soybean prices at the farm gate.
And the article quantified this impact.
It did. It highlighted that soybean DOC prices have fallen by about 30% over the last 2 years. And crucially, this has dragged down the price farmers get for their soybean grain. It mentioned prices around 4,300 rupees per quintal.
Which is below the MSP, isn't it?
Yes, significantly below the minimum support price, which was set at 4,892 rupees per quintal. So farmers are actually getting less than the government's benchmark price.
So we're seeing a real split here. Clear winners and losers emerging from this whole ethanol situation.
Definitely. On one hand, you have maize farmers. They're broadly benefiting. The huge demand from ethanol plants has pushed maize prices up, often to or even above the MSP of 2,225 rupees per quintal. They're getting good returns.
Good for them.
But on the other hand, you have soybean farmers. They are really struggling. The reduced demand for soy DOC, driven by the availability of cheaper DDGS, has hammered their prices, pushing them below MSP levels.
A tough spot for them. And what about the feed industry itself? They're caught in the middle, right? Paying more for maize, but maybe getting some relief from cheaper DDGS, yet facing overall market pressure.
It's definitely a tricky position for them. Their main energy source, maize, is much more expensive. Their traditional protein source, soy DOC, is facing competition from a cheaper alternative, DDGS, which itself is a result of the high maize use for ethanol. It's complex. But the high maize price is the immediate overriding concern for them.
So what are they asking for? What's the solution from their perspective?
Understandably, given the high domestic maize prices, the feed industry is pushing hard for the government to liberalize maize imports. They want access to cheaper maize from the global market.
What are the import rules right now? Is it completely banned?
Not completely banned, but restricted. India currently allows imports of up to 500,000 tons, zero point 0.5 millitet of maize per year at a relatively low tariff of 15%.
Okay, a small quota.
Yes. Anything above that quota faces a steep 50% import duty. And crucially, there's a blanket ban on importing any genetically modified GM maize for food or feed use.
Has India been importing any maize recently under these rules?
Yes, actually. The data for April 2024 to January 2025 shows imports totaled about 0.94 million tons, so slightly above the low tariff quota.
Where did it come from?
Mostly from Myanmar, about 0.51 million tons, and also Ukraine, around 0.39 million tons. And importantly, all of this imported maize was non-GM. It had to be.
So given those restrictions, what specific change is the feed industry lobbying for? They can't just import unlimited cheap maize.
Their specific proposal is quite nuanced.
Mhm.
They're asking the government to consider allowing imports of GM maize, which is generally cheaper and more readily available globally.
Ah, the GM angle.
Yes. And this is the crucial part, they propose allowing it only for ethanol production, not for food, not for feed.
Just for the ethanol plants.
Exactly. The idea would be to have very strict controls, segregation, and monitoring safeguards, basically to ensure none of that imported GM maize accidentally leaks into the human food or animal feed supply chains. It's an attempt to ease the pressure on domestic maize supply for ethanol without compromising food feed safety concerns around GMOs.
That's quite a specific proposal. It opens up a whole can of worms regarding international trade, doesn't it?
Yes.
If India did allow GM maize imports, even just for fuel.
Oh, absolutely. The big global GM maize exporters, think the U.S., Brazil, Argentina, they'd be very interested. The U.S. in particular has been looking for new markets since China cut back on its maize imports. India allowing GM maize, even for a specific purpose, would be a huge potential market opening for them.
But is importing maize, GM or otherwise, the only way forward? Or the best way? The article also mentioned boosting domestic production, right?
Yes, and that's a really critical point many experts emphasize. Instead of relying on imports, perhaps a more sustainable long-term solution is to focus on increasing India's own maize output.
How could that be done? Just plant more maize.
Well, partly, maybe, but it's more about increasing yields, getting more maize per hectare through better seeds, better farming practices, better irrigation where needed. And also potentially looking at strategically shifting some land away from crops that are very water hungry and already in surplus, like maybe rice in some areas, towards maize cultivation.
So grow more maize domestically more efficiently.
Exactly. The argument is that this could be a potential win-win. You meet the growing demand for ethanol feedstock from domestic sources, which benefits Indian maize farmers, without needing potentially controversial imports, and without putting quite so much pressure on the feed sector or causing these negative knock-on effects for other farmers, like the soybean growers.
Avoids hurting the soybean and maybe even cotton sectors, as the article hinted.
Potentially, yes. By boosting domestic supply sufficiently, you could theoretically satisfy the ethanol demand and the traditional feed demand without prices skyrocketing quite so much, and without needing the cheaper DDGS to undercut soybean quite so drastically. It's about finding a better balance domestically.
Okay, let's try and wrap our heads around this. This deep dive really highlights a complex web, doesn't it? Biofuel policy driving maize demand, which impacts livestock feed costs, which then, through the DDGS byproduct, hits the soybean market.
It's a fascinating case study in interconnectedness. The diversion of maize to ethanol has clearly created winners, mainly maize farmers, seeing higher prices but also significant challenges, especially for soybean farmers facing price slumps and the feed industry grappling with costs.
What really stands out is how a policy aimed at one goal, renewable energy, reducing fossil fuel use, has sent these powerful tremors through the entire agricultural system.
It really does. And it brings up a core question, especially for you, the listener, and particularly those of you preparing for the UPSC exams. This is prime material. How does India balance these competing demands? How do you pursue biofuel goals without destabilizing vital food and feed industries and without hurting the livelihoods of large groups of farmers?
That's the central dilemma.
Thinking about the long-term sustainability, the broader economic impacts. It's crucial. This whole situation is gold for your UPSC prep. It covers agricultural policy, biofuel economics, market linkages, MSP issues, import-export dynamics, even GMO debates. Really try to analyze the different angles we've discussed.
Yeah, the gains for maize farmers, the pain for soybean farmers, the feed industry's predicament, the import versus domestic production debate. It's all there.
And it leads to a final thought for you to chew on. What specific policy tweaks or interventions could actually work here? How could policymakers navigate this to find a path that supports energy goals and agricultural stability? Is there a sweet spot?
We really hope this deep dive has given you some solid insights into this really important and evolving issue. If you found this useful, especially if you're tracking Indian agriculture economics or prepping for the UPSC, please do give us a like, subscribe for more analyses like this, and definitely drop a comment.
Yeah, we'd love to hear your questions or your take on potential solutions. What do you think is the best way forward? And just to reiterate, our discussion today was based heavily on that insightful article from the Indian Express.
Thanks so much for tuning in today.